Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar. My name is Alison Thompson with BC Forest Safety Council, and I'm here with my colleagues Gerard Messier and Sue Reed, along with our guest presenter Shannon Overland of DECRA Strategic Consulting. This webinar is a second in a supervisor series. We're very excited to bring this to you. I wanted to acknowledge, first of all, that we are located in Nanaimo, BC, on the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, including the territories of the Snuneymuxw First Nation. And just a few technical things to get started. We do have a chat function and questions. If you would like to ask our presenter any questions, please use the questions function. And if you have any difficulties at all, please call our office and Sue Reed can help you with any technical difficulties. The chat is also available for you there too. And building off the success of our last webinar, Tips to Successfully Transition into Supervision, Shannon Overland has returned to talk about influencing culture through questions. We're very excited to hear what she has to say, and we very much appreciate Shannon fitting us into her very busy schedule. So thank you, Shannon, and I'm going to turn my camera off and make the transition for you.
Okay. Thanks, Alison. As I wait for this presenter mode to come across, really excited to be back. And what we're going to be talking about today really kind of triggers into some of my own passion area around inquiry, questions, as well as intentional listening. So I want to take you through sort of the outline and the objectives of what we want to talk about today. And again, as I said, a lot of this has to do with my own personal passion coming up through as a supervisor, as a leader, and then having a lot of time on site listening to the types of conversations that occur out there. We often talk about the directive nature, you know, how we can be so directive, how we can tell, and why we want to come back and ask. So that's going to be one of the objectives that we're going to cover today. On top of that, I want to talk to you very specifically around the anatomy of a question. What makes a best practice around questioning? What are some of the tips and tricks that we can utilize, as well as how do we get higher up in the conversation level that will actually allow people to become more reflective, to be more collaborative, and those aspects that really do help culture evolve. We'll talk a little bit about culture as well and how all of these practices really kind of give that push forward. All of these, again, just like the last webinar that we talked about, include what kind of changes are we willing to make. The final one in here that I want to talk to you about is the concept of intentional listening. And, you know, a lot of the times we use active listening, and so I'm going to show you how this changes even a little bit more so. So how do we recognize engagement, and specifically how we ask questions, as being sort of that critical factor to build trust, psychological safety, relationships, and accountability? All four of those factors are really necessary when we do want to evolve culture. And so that's going to be one of the main points in here. Also, you're going to walk out of here with the ability to advance your own engagement skills. And it's not going to take a lot of effort to do so. It's going to take sort of being a focused practice and really being able to self-reflect on it. When we change up our own engagement skills, we have the ability to create moments of transformation. We get the ability to start having people have insightful moments, you know, the ahas. And I'm going to talk to you in a little bit in terms of why those become so important, especially when we want to get to that next level. And the final one in here, as I said, you know what, if we're going to put in an intentional practice of asking powerful questions, and you're going to hear me say that a lot, we have to also be able to listen. And, you know, active listening a lot of the time involves us nodding our heads and saying yes and that. And the intentional listening really tries to go into that deeper level. All right. So with those moments of transformation, that's where we start impacting ourselves, okay, our workforce, our team members, whatever our terminology is, as well as the organization itself. So that's really what we're looking at accomplishing in the next probably 45 minutes or so before we turn it over to questions. So we want to start off with a poll today. And the poll question is really, I want you to think about how you typically use questions right now. All right, so I've got 4 different categories in here. And the very first one is, hey, you know what? I use the 5 whys. So we use an implemented investigation that, like 5 why, where we are pursuing questions in that element. Beyond that, how about to confirm that actions have been completed? Going out there and making sure that people have followed up on those things that they do. Or maybe I like to poll my coworkers and team when decisions are made. So asking what their opinions are and what they're thinking about. And the final one is, hey, you know what? I got limited time to ask. It's a busy day out there, and it's a whole lot easier to provide direction. So as that poll goes up, if you can select whichever one is most appropriate for you, or interested, I'm interested to hear where we split off and if we split off. Okay, so it looks like at the top, using the 5 why system or a similar function when conducting investigations. And you know what, that's actually been a fairly common response, but very close after that is that confirmation that actions have been completed, also very common. Polling my workers and team when decisions are made, which is more that collaborative spirit. And fantastic to see, nobody said, hey, I don't have time to ask questions. It's a lot easier just to provide direction. So that's great. So what I see in those responses is that, as I said before, everybody's going to have an opportunity to see something a little bit differently, okay? And to move forward in this. The very first part that I want to talk about is, what is a question? That may seem pretty simple because, I mean, all you have to do is put the question mark at the end and that's what it is. But you know what, when we talk about why asking, it gets a little bit more complex than that. And what I find is in the real world, when we're in the workshops and we're talking about it, or we're not on the work site, it's real easy to talk about what good questions look like. What happens though is when people transfer that into the work environment, they get in their natural environment, they're having those conversations, there's a whole other level of observations that come in to suggest that we don't necessarily make that connection when we hit the field. So where we can talk about, hey, I ask open-ended questions, when we get to the field, they're not actually truly open-ended questions. So that's one part. We're going to talk about some of the roles. What are some of the different roles that, number one, questions can serve as, so we can get that collaborative spirit, we can actually get confirmation that people are with us, we can get problem solving out of them. And so there's a whole series of that. I'm going to show you a model a little bit further on that I call a sort of a funnel model that's going to kind of dive into that a little bit more as well. One of the other concepts in here is one of rescue versus responsibility. And that's really an easy way or a deeper way of talking about ask versus tell. You know, when we're out there with team members, when we're part of the organization, when we're, you know, creating conversations with people, and I don't know really what it hinges on. Maybe it can be the lack of time, maybe it can be just an unawareness, but it's real easy to step into what we call a rescue mode. That's where we want to slip into that tell mode, or to more that directive mode. We notice that people are maybe slow in responding to a question, or we just feel that, hey, I've got a lot of knowledge that I want to sort of assert out there and I want to share it. The responsibility side of that is when we actually really elicit, take that time, pause for that reflection, and get people to step in and truly be co-creators of what we're trying to achieve. Recognizing that that might mean some awkward silences, that might mean some hums and haws, it might not bring the right answer out or the answer that we're expecting. Okay, and I just, you know, as I say that, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we call mental models as well. The final thing in here is human potential. And this is a really kind of neat and exciting part of what we're experiencing from a coaching perspective, is that co-creation or that coactive creation of solutions. Now, as I said before, when we talk about cultural indicators, you know, we can start right back at what I might call a reactive culture, where things are more punitive. That's where people will stand up and say, hey, what's safety? I mean, things go wrong here. People are going to get hurt. Luckily, a lot of that stuff is in our past. Okay, we're not necessarily there in that mindset anymore. We evolve up into more of a compliance mindset. And that's, hey, we have to do these activities. We have to do these things. We've got different regulations in that we need to meet. And so we come in and we start creating systems in order to meet those. We can often get stuck in that kind of a situation. I know in my role as an auditor, a lot of the times, one of the big pieces of feedback back into the organization is, hey, start taking a look at the system that you have in place right now and asking yourself the questions, have we created any kind of confusion? Do we have any gaps out here? What kind of redundancy do we have? Do we have anything that is conflicting one another? Because we can get really stymied there. Where we want to go with the human potential is to move past that into a state where, we could call that a values-driven culture. We can call it an interdependency. And that's where we really look at where people, regardless of what level they are in the organization, are doing the right thing. They're willing to reach out to their neighbor and say, hey, listen, I noticed that we've got an exposure there and it's something that we need to address. They can reach up, they can reach down. So to tap into that human potential, we have to be very willing as leaders to put our biases aside, put our assumptions aside, and sometimes put our knowledge aside and truly ask the questions so that we can tap into the resources that we have. What I'm kind of alluding to right now is the whole concept of mental maps. So every single one of us goes into our experiences based on our past. All right, the sum of our experiences of the past is what truly defines what we're expecting in the future. Those mental models and mental maps can really limit us to some extent as well. Those can bring together our biases, they can bring together the assumptions, some of the perceptions that we bring in, how we can somehow get tunnel visioned. When we look at mental maps, we have to be able to disrupt them. Because when we look at culture, a lot of the definitions of culture come down to it's simply the way we do things out here. One of the best ones that I've read lately that I like and I kind of grab with me is culture is the collective personality of the organization. I hear quite often as we're in workshops and talking to people that culture is really what happens when nobody's watching. There's all these different descriptors of culture, but what we've got to realize is culture is what truly influences how we behave going forward. We come in with our own biases and assumptions, we meld those all together, and now we have culture. So if we want to basically move ourselves away from that, we need change. And what we need is we need change on the individual level and we need change on the organizational level. And some of the most common or the most recent academic research I've seen, especially around the coaching models, is that change truly comes from a moment of insight. All right, so when we talk about neuroscience and we talk about learning new tricks and learning new things, it's been established that we can learn right up to, the day that we decide to go to a better place. We can create new neural pathways, we can produce more neural diversity, and by doing so, we expand our thinking. But what that change requires is an internal moment of insight. I need to have that aha moment. All right. I can't come in as a leader and suggest those moments of insight to people. They are going to see them either through maybe a demonstration or an observation that they have an opportunity to reflect on, or maybe it's a conversation that from a leadership perspective, I can engage in them with. But that's what we want. 20% of that change mechanism comes from that moment of insight. The other 80% comes from intense initial practice. We then have to intentionally put that in order. The other part of this, especially when it comes to influencing that culture, as I said earlier, I mentioned, a label of, say, values-driven culture, taking from the compliance, from the have to possibly to, hey, here's where we want to go. When we look at interdependency, where we want to go, there's going to be a real aspect of that that is dependent on that coactive development. And when we talk about coactive development, it's really how do I as a leader, how do I as a supervisor involve that person so that that conversation becomes more of a dialogue back and forth as opposed to that monologue. Or what you're going to see in the funnel model, something that is very limited. So a lot of you have said, hey, I'm asking questions. So the ability here is to look at, hey, how do I excel in my inquiry skills based on what I'm doing right now? The other part around influencing culture with questions comes down to accountability. And this is a real challenging one, because where we really want to transfer that accountability is to the personal side. Is people actually, one of the biggest things that I hear in there is, why can't they just do this? You know, they know what the expectations are. Why can't they just follow the rules? Well, that would be a whole other webinar in terms of why people don't necessarily follow the rules. But there's one element in there in a questioning approach, and you're going to see a bit of a demo that Gerardo and I are going to do in a little bit that's going to help define this further. But there are techniques within a questioning approach that can help people make that connection to why they want to be doing the right thing. Moving forward, let's take a look. We're going to do a little bit of an activity here. So I really encourage you, Gerard and I are going to do a little bit of a role play. And in that time, if you don't have a pen around you, grab a pen. I want you to think about this kind of a scenario. You notice one of your team members is using equipment that you are absolutely certain was reported as broken, malfunctioning, requiring attention earlier in the day. I want you to listen to this. I want you to be thinking, how would I approach this? So Gerard and I are going to demonstrate one way that that conversation can go. So Gerard, are you ready?
I am ready.
Okay. Now I got to warn you all, Gerard's pretty tough. Hey, Gerard, can you come over here for a sec?
Yeah, sure. What's up?
Why do you think I called you over here?
I don't know. I'm pretty busy actually. This we're shut down right now, and I got to get this fixed. So yeah, what's up?
Yeah, well, I know that, but I also see that you're out here with some equipment that you're not supposed to have. So what can you be doing about that?
I don't know. It's working fine.
Yeah, but I mean, you know what our policy is around that. I mean, we're supposed to, if it's tagged out or if it was reported as broken or anything, we're supposed to really get it back to the equipment crib. I don't want to put anybody else in danger.
Yeah, I know about that.
Okay, well, I mean, seriously, what are you going to do about it, though?
I don't know. I'll go get another grinder, I guess.
Okay, well, do you think you could do that right now?
Yeah, sure. Or yeah, okay, I'll do it.
Yeah, okay, well, I don't know that I like your attitude all that much, because I mean, this is all about safety and we don't want to hurt anybody.
Yeah, well, yeah, I know, but we're down, and it's I got to get it fixed because everybody's just standing around.
No, I get that, and I mean, we don't want to have that happen either, and we got to get the job done. But I can't really have you out here with this stuff, if we're not supposed to have it.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks a lot, George. Thanks. Okay. We put a little bit of a conversation out in front of you right now, and I mean, I kind of pick up snippets of that conversation from multiple that I get to observe. But here's what I want you to do. We're going to go silent for a couple minutes, and if you haven't, I want you to take a couple minutes and I want you to write down some of the things that you would address in that conversation, and specifically around what questions might you ask. Don't overthink this. Just write down 3 or 4 questions that you might ask in this situation, okay? So I'm just gonna be quiet for a minute or two, which is really hard for me, by the way. Okay, I'm gonna take you through a few more slides, and these slides are really designed to start helping us think about what kind of things can we be thinking about as we ask questions. As I say down at the bottom, I want you to think and consider how your questions compare to some of these best practices. If you're working along and you see an opportunity to make a change or a tweak to your question, go ahead and do it. We're going to come back to it after. Gerard and I are going to do another role play. So let's start off with the best practice. I have spent a ton of time looking at this stuff, and it really took to doing a professional mentor coaching session and becoming certified an executive coach in the last few years that really tied this in. Here's the typical questions up on the screen: who, what, when, why, where, and how. If we can remember back to Sesame Street days, for whoever did that, I mean, that's how I learned them. I would tell you right now that 2 of those words are best practice. And the 2 words are what and how. Now, what I'll also share with you, I would typically ask that if we were able to interact with each other. When I typically ask that in a workshop, I will get one of what or how, and I will typically get the why question. And I want to make this very clear right now, and it kind of goes against the whole principle of 5 why. However, the why question is one that I will suggest that you stay away from. And there's some reasonings why I want you to look to stay away from them. I'm not saying you have to eliminate it. We'll talk about that in a second. But by staying away from it, I mean, hey, let's avoid it, because there's a couple things that happen with why. Number one, why can be very subjective. You ask why something is going, and now you get that person's personal opinion. And that's not necessarily what's going to be very practical or helpful for you. The other part is we actually know that the why question stimulates, when asked the why question, stimulates the same part of our brain that physical pain is felt in or stimulated. And so I want you to think, why is equal to pain in the brain? People become defensive, people become standoffish. I'm going to throw that one out to you. The other best practice that I want to share with you is that of being simply curious. I talked to you earlier about mental models, the different biases and assumptions that we bring into play. A lot of times when we get into conversation, we want to put forth what we are aware of, what we know. We want to put that in, and especially from a leadership or a supervisor position, you know, that's been a big part of sort of the historical evolution of supervisors. Tell them what you know. And it's very important to the workforce that their supervisor or leader has an idea of what's going on as well. They'll tell you often they don't need to be the subject matter expert, but they have to have an awareness. One of the big powerful elements that we can get that also starts getting into that interdependency that we talked about from a cultural standpoint is to be curious enough to have an understanding of what our people know as well. There have been so many times, folks, where people walk away, senior leaders, folks who have been in the senior leader position for 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, and they walk away from one of these conversations and they say, man, I had never heard that before. That's a powerful moment of safety transformation for somebody, because realizing that they hadn't heard it before because they had never taken the time to ask and listen. Here's sort of a dialogue funnel that I personally have been working on for a couple of years now. This is a result of listening to so many conversations out there. So as you'll see up at the top of the funnel, which is where ideally we want to start, we're really talking about busting down those biases by listening to people's perspective. So that includes language such as, hey, you know what? Even though you think you know what's going on, folks, walk in and just say to somebody, hey, tell me what's going on here today. Tell me what you're dealing with. Show me what you're working on. And right there, what often happens is people will give you the background that solves a lot of the questions that might be in your head. Where in prior worlds, you might have just stepped in and say, hey, I notice you're not doing this, or I notice that you are doing this, and I think you should do it differently. Right here gets us to step back, park all of our biases and assumptions, and just really get a big picture view from the workforce, from team members, you know, what their experience is. When we think about from a safety perspective, I told you before, the what and the how questions are truly your best practice questions. Now, with that, I also want to say that what and how questions aren't always asked with what and how. Just like a why question doesn't have to be asked with a why. We can ask a why question with a what or a how. You know, why did you do it that way? Tell me what you're working on. You know, what's going on? What's setting up? You know, what's influencing your behavior right now? The what and the how can bring us down into the exposure itself. What's going on in the environment? What the problem is they're dealing with? Do they see it? Do they understand it? From a very simplest perspective is, hey, listen, what could hurt you out here? You know, how could you get hurt out here? What could go wrong here? All of those can be utilized as, you know, whether it's safety related, whether it's production related, whether it's quality control related, any element of what we talk about from a leadership perspective, we can address and get a larger response with a what and how question. Now, what I'll always say too is sometimes people don't necessarily come along with those conversations. What could go wrong? Nothing. How could you get hurt? I can't. I've been here 20 years. Nothing's ever happened to me before. And so I'll always put this in here as well, is the specific what if question. If we ever have barriers in the conversation, challenges to the dialogue, but we want to move it on, we have the ability even there to use a what if question. If it's specific to somebody in an exposure situation who is in denial or at least denying it to us, hey, what would happen if you didn't use 3-point contact and you slipped off the track? Or what would happen? Nothing. I've been doing this forever. Okay, well, what if you did, and because you were coming out backwards, you fell backwards, and take a look at the ground here. We got a bunch of rocks, boulders, and trees with a bunch of broken branches head up. That hit the back of your neck. It allows you to come into the conversation with a very plausible part presented on the table. The majority of people at that point, well, yeah, okay, you know what, they got me. So that's kind of in a feedback conversation, but it works in a variety of ways. I love utilizing it in any kind of a safety briefing. Hey folks, you know what if we had an emergency situation today? What if we had a weather event come through? What would we do? When we go past that, we can become much more specific. And we can still lean into the 5 whys, or not the 5 whys, pardon me, the 5 W's, who, what, when, why, where, and the how. This is where the why can actually be appropriate. If I've guided the conversation down to the point where we really know what the parameters are, maybe we're doing some maintenance on a piece of equipment or something, and the question is, why would you use this tool versus this tool? Or why would you use this process versus this process? It's very clear what we're talking about, and there's not a whole lot of ability to go out on that subjective level. Next to that comes down the controls. I want to really pinpoint any conversation down into, what do we need to go forward? What do we need to understand? How are we going to control the exposure? What do we need to fix? What do we need to follow up? And so there we've got that conversation. And then the final thing in here comes down to the actionable result. What is our action going forward? Is it a follow-up on something that came up on an incident report? Is it something that I need to take and go do some research around some new equipment? What is it? Here's what I'll tell you about the funnel. Here's my field observations on the funnel. The majority of time when people walk into the field and they want to start this questioning process, they start it often at a 6, right down at the action. They very quickly, even if they've told me that open-ended questions are their best friends, they very easily go in and they will say, hey, do this. Hey, you need to take this action. Sometimes they'll step up a little bit and they will actually start talking about the controls. Hey, listen, in order to eliminate that exposure, you need to do this. And beyond that, when they do get up into questions, true questions, one of two things happens. Number one, they will go into a closed-ended question. Sort of like what I asked Gerard earlier. Hey, do you know why I called you over? Do you know that this thing can hurt you? Do you know that you're in the wrong? Those questions that are yes or no. Or they will come in with the W questions or the H question, but they are so specific that it almost feels like a rapid fire test. Hey, List, how are you going to do this heavy lift with a crane? What are you going to do to make sure that you're safe? Use a tagline. What's the tagline? Who's going to be the spotter? What's the rating on the tagline? And it's this whole series of very quick, short questions that take these responses. And what you'll see happen in the field is people will be like, I feel like I'm being tested. So what's the main message here? Is the self-reflection and the ability to kind of understand, where am I on here? Again, I'm going to kind of direct you back to your own questions. Where did you start off? Did you come in hot? Did you come in hot about the fact that, hey, the grinder's broken and you're not using it properly, or it hasn't been tagged out? Or did we step back and ask more of that perspective? The next level I want to take you to in here is around the intentional listening. Because regardless of what the conversation is, one of the toughest things that you can do, especially starting out, if you're starting to think about questions and listening, this is tough stuff. I always think about a duck on the water. In this funnel, if you're really focused on improving, what you see happen a lot of times is you see a duck floating on the water and they're just calmly bobbing along. What you don't realize is there's a current under the water and those poor little feet are going about 1,000,000 miles an hour. And that's what I think of every time I think about this dynamic. The intentional listening is so critical because you've got to get your question out, and then you've got to be able to sit back and truly hear what that person says, because that's what's going to inform the next question. That's where this stuff becomes real magic. The next thing that I want to kind of show you in here is if we're looking at the questions, very often people start off with those closed-ended questions. Hey, do you know what the plan is? Did you do your pre-trip inspection today? Do you know why I called you over here? They are yes/no questions. And I just had an example of it in the site that I'm on right now. One of the individuals said, hey, I went out and I asked questions at the end of my safety briefing and nobody responded. I don't get it. What was the question? Anybody have any safety concerns? And you know what? We're so programmed into asking that question, and yet the majority of the time, on average, it goes dead because it's a closed-ended question. Yes and no responses, or it could elicit a one-word response. But on the positive, we can also use those closed-ended questions to get people's confirmation and commitment. Hey, are you willing to go forward with that? Are you willing to take on that responsibility going forward? Yes, no. The next level in here, and this is the next common one that people go to, they go to what I call the leading question. Well, I don't call it, it's called the leading question. And so with leading questions, hey, you're going to double check that plan, right? We lead them into the response that we're asking for. The problem with it is that the underlying message is already given. Often we give the answer in the question itself. The other challenge is they can come across as really quite passive. All right, passive aggressive, and they'll start to take heed of that. The final one is the open-ended questions. And so you've heard me say these ones multiple times already. These three questions, as well as, hey, what would you do what would be required to pause work, have been in my back pocket for the better part of 10, 12 years. For the first 10 years where I was really thinking, I want to get better at questioning, those were my go-tos. And I got to tell you right now, they served me very well. They're mid-level in the water because they're short. You know, we're looking for specific answers. What could go wrong? They can also be answered with that nothing. How could you get hurt? Well, you know, I could fall, or nothing. What can you do differently? Starts getting us down into that action. The other thing I want you to think about is getting deeper in the waterline. So with those more reflective and solution-based questions. So, hey, what could you do to make this happen? What would make this easier? I'm not going to read all of these, but hey, what is success going to look like? What's under your control? What isn't? And how are you going to deal with this? Those are more powerful questions that get people to reflect deeply on whatever the topic is. And here's a couple of the winners. It's the what if, which I already talked about, and what else. So as we start learning to ask deeper questions, people will give you the easiest answer first. Our opportunity there with our intentional listening is to sit back a little bit and then say, oh, that's interesting, what else? And force people to come down further and further and further. Now, as we were talking about culture, this is kind of that real depth that gets that self-reflection that starts evolving a deeper level of collaboration. That's what really ties into what I was calling about that interdependency. In that supervisor or that leadership role with the team member, we're really becoming a team here. The other part in here too is I am valuing the responses of people. This builds trust. This builds that psychological safety. This brings in that collaborative spirit and those things that we need to really get on the same page and move forward in the same direction. I want to pull Gerard back in because I want you to think about that little scenario with the grinder. And we're going to run through this conversation again. And I'm going to encourage you, I'm actually going to back up. Sorry, I don't mean to be so confusing to you, but I'm going to back up to the funnel. And as we go through this conversation, I want you to kind of think about where are we at, how are we moving through this, and see if you can watch that conversation progress. Gerard, once again, just a reminder, he's out there working. He's working with a piece of equipment, a grinder in this case, that I'm pretty sure is the leader on site was actually reported damaged. Hey, Gerard, can I take a couple minutes of your time, please?
Yeah, I guess so. I'm really busy. We're kind of down, and I need to fix this to get us going again. But yeah, what's up?
Yeah. Okay. Well, you know what? Hey, I appreciate you stepping aside for a couple seconds, and I know you guys are super busy, but can you give me a little bit of your perspective of what's going on here? What are you working on?
Well, the whole operation's down. I've got to grind this down before I weld it, and yeah, that's why everybody's standing around. They're just kind of waiting for me to weld this up, and so we can start back up again.
Okay. And that's what I was curious about, because I was quite sure that the grinder that you're using had been tagged out earlier this day, and I just wanted to find out if what you knew about that.
Yeah, it was tagged out, and then I fixed it. It was a problem with the switch. I fixed a lot of these. So yeah, it was tagged out. I fixed it, and now I'm working.
Okay, I'm curious, when you say you fixed a lot of them, is this something that's been going through our, our PM program, or being reported back up to any of our mechanics in the tool shed there? The tool
Not really. Like these grinders, the switch fails all the time, and I know how to fix it. So rather than just kind of going through the process, especially today when we're so busy and we got to get things going, I can fix it, so I do, and then I just take the tag off and go to work.
Okay. Listen, Jordan, and I have to say, I really appreciate, that you're trying to get this done, but I do have a couple concerns. And you know what, if we're doing the quick fix in that, what could go wrong in that situation?
I don't know. I'm certainly not an electrician. I'm a welder, but yeah, I seem to be fairly successful in fixing the switch, but I suppose I could be wrong. It's yeah, I'm not really an electrician, but yeah.
Okay. How do you think you could get hurt in this situation?
Well, grinders hurt lots of people. That's probably our number one tool that hurts people here is these grinders. There's problems with them a lot. So yeah, I suppose I'm not immune to that either. Grinder could bite me as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I appreciate you being aware of that. We have had several incidents with these things, throwing a wheel and breaking off pieces and that. So with you out here, and again, I mean, I see the drive to get the thing fixed, but what if you fix it in that second? And let's say one of our newer guys who hasn't really had any of that experience with these grinders ends up picking it up, thinking that it's okay, and is using it for the first time or one of the first times.
Yeah, I guess, yeah. I've had a couple of apprentices kind of watch me do the quick fix on the grinders, so it's probably not the best. I maybe mentioned that they shouldn't do that, or we're in a rush, so this is okay at this time. But yeah, it probably doesn't. On second thought, it doesn't send the best message to those guys.
Yeah, and again, you said multiple times that you're in a rush, and I think we get in a lot of trouble when we're doing that, especially when we run up. It sounds like maybe we've got a deeper issue with some of these. Have you given any thought to that?
Oh yeah, these grinders are crap. I don't know why we spend the money on. We keep buying the same grinders, and the switches keep going on them. So yeah, yeah. If I had my way, we would be buying a whole different brand of model of grinder, because these are junk.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you say that, Gerard, because I haven't necessarily even heard that they've been a problem. So, it makes me wonder, are we getting that information passed up the line so that we know that? Because I have no problem putting in some orders for a different brand, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, that would be good, because I've mentioned it a few times, but after 3 or 4 times, nothing. They just keep getting the same grinders, or I just have to fix them again. I don't know. I don't like listening to myself talk, so I just kind of didn't bother. Just fixed it myself. It was easier and faster.
Yeah, and you know what? I really appreciate your honesty there. I want to get past this, and I want to make sure that everybody is in a safe place with this. So, what could we be doing in the meantime?
Well, if you could buy some better grinders, and we wouldn't have to worry about getting them fixed all the time. And yeah, in the meantime, I better talk to those apprentices that I showed the quick fix and tell them not to do it, and tell them that we'll do it properly. And I don't know, maybe I can talk to the electricians, and maybe they can just change the switch or something before they wear out. And so it always seems to be a bit of a panic situation when they don't work, and we gotta, do the quick fix. So maybe there's something we can do there.
Yeah, and I'm going to support you in that. I got one more question for you. When you come up against, you got these time pressures and that, but when you come up against not having the right equipment, or it's not in the right condition, what do you think your best course of action is to do there?
Yeah, well, production is number one, right? As far as I know. So if I got the message from the supervisor or the manager that, like, if they don't see me working and trying to fix something right away, like, if they can give me the okay to wait till everything's fine with the equipment, then I'd be on board. But yeah, it's right now, I can see your point, but I don't know if everybody's necessarily on board with it. So.
And that's a fair statement. I want to let you know right now, I mean, I'll have additional conversations about this, but what I want to really hear you say is that, hey, listen, if I don't have the right stuff, I'm going to pause, and here's what I'll say. If you're not feeling fully supportive, I want you to know I've got your back, and you reach out to me directly, and we'll look at putting the proper solutions in place. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's totally fair. If I can kind of drop your name and bring you into the conversation, I think that make me more comfortable anyway, just kind of stopping until we have things in place.
Yeah, absolutely. And please do. And understand, I don't think there's anybody out here who's intending to hurt anybody, but this is definitely something we want to get aligned on, because it just sounds like, I mean, you put a couple new solutions for us, and we just want to get that information shared. So I just want to let you know I appreciate that from you today.
All right, fair enough. Can I go back and do my job?
Right, but what are you going to do rather than use that grinder?
I'm going to get another grinder, one that's not typed out.
Awesome. All right. Hey, listen, I'll take that forward. Hey, listen, if you don't hear anything from me within the end of the week, can you come back and rattle my cage and just make sure that you're holding me accountable to this as well?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thanks, Gerard. Okay, so a little bit of a longer conversation. So as you were listening to that, and again, just pardon me as I streak through this slide, let's get into this next poll. If you're thinking about the past content that we did through there, I want you to think now, where did you find your original questions to be? A, it says my questions were more specific. So I was sort of in that mid funnel down to the bottom. Shorter answers, very specific to exactly what I know. As I said, maybe more of a testing environment. Number two, that I was using why questions more than I could have. Number C in there, my questions were more closed-ended. So what you're noticing now is that your questions were more yes and no. And D is I'm utilizing the what and how deeper below the waterline, so that you're recognizing, hey, I am getting that deeper collaborative spirit, looking at partnering with people on a different level. And I'm interested in this one too, because this one, all the field time I have, I've got a pretty good mental model myself around what we typically see.
All right, let's share the results.
Okay. So we've got mid-funnel, the whys, a little bit more closed-ended. So we're kind of across the whole thing. And I see that we've got a large group or a good part of you who are saying, hey, I'm already using those deeper questions. So that's fantastic. I just want to very quickly talk to you about, I talked earlier about active listening. We've got mental models specific to active listening. And so when those come in, it has a lot of the repeating what they said, nodding, acknowledging. The big things is, as we are intentionally listening, we want to be engaged in that conversation by asking further questions, creating further discovery, and engaging in dialogue. We want to make the experience a positive experience for the other. How do we make that a safe environment? Hoping that you heard a lot of appreciative conversation, sentences within that conversation with Gerard that made him a part of the solution, acknowledged what he was dealing with. Feedback often also occurs naturally as suggestions do as well. In that conversation with Gerard, I want to make him part of it. I want to make his role as related to his influence over others to be part of it. Those are all those different cultural attributes that indicate that, hey, you know what? We truly are making that cultural evolution. So here's some interesting information because, man, you know what? Listening can be difficult. I already talked about the mental models, the biases and the assumptions that we bring into conversations. And so how do we shake those loose and become more curious with them? The second one, and this is really, I love this one. I call this the big fish story. Autobiographical listening is the state where we are listening, and whatever that person is talking about inspires us to jump into the conversation and relate our own experience or our own facts. So I call it the big fish story because somebody says, hey, you should have seen, I went out, caught this big fish, and then there's 3 other people in the room who want to talk about the bigger fish. So that is a real barrier. And I really challenge you to sit back and start listening to conversations and see how often this happens. How often I see people literally crawl up each other's back to get into a conversation to drop their fun fact in. The final one in here is talking and sex. And so what I want to share with you here is when we talk about ourselves, there's research that tells us that there is dopamine produced, and it's the same dopamine, it comes from the same area that is stimulated when cocaine is ingested, when sugar is ingested, and when people have sex. Talking about ourselves gives that pleasure response. And so that's one of the challenges for ourselves as leaders is how do we monitor that and keep that back so that we are talking less and listening more. The biggest thing out there we can do is bite our tongue. And so folks, I'll just populate and then chat to it. As a closeout, our tendency and our natural tendency is to be more directive, actually telling versus asking. Our challenge is to start to changing those models. Our challenge is also to become more powerful in utilizing the open-ended questions. That is what's going to enable organizations to co-create change, proactively create change through the behaviors that we can influence. Transitioning to powerful open-ended questions requires intentional practice. You have to be out there thinking about it. Same thing with the listening. People will come to me and say, I'm not that great a listener. And I'll say, well, how much time have you spent focused on it? Well, none. Well, of course you're not going to be good. Focus in on those what and how questions. Get to the top of the funnel. Get deeper under the waterline. Also, understand that powerful questions invite deep reflection, the co-creation of actions and behavioral changes necessary for what we want to do in terms of evolving that culture forward. Listening is hard. I said that before. There's multiple elements that distract us, including our own neurological makeup. And we want to be, I'm not saying there's not a time for being directive, but there is always an opportunity to create dialogue, that coactive creation of dialogue. And with that, my part of the webinar comes to an end. So what I would like to do is open up the one last poll. What is your best intentional action to further build competence in your engagement abilities? What are you going to be intentional about? Utilizing what and how? Focusing on the deeper questions under the waterline, practicing intentional listening skills and biting your tongue, or recognizing and pausing your own biases in order to get others' perspective. So let's see what this is, and then I'm going to pass it back over to Allison, who can close us out for the day.
Okay, and here's the results.
I like that around the listening. You know what? My own observation out in the field, it is probably one of the most underdeveloped skills that we have. Even when we ask good questions, we will often have a challenge with the listening part. I think what it looks like is we've got some really good actions going forward. I really encourage you to be reflective of those, to develop those, and to continue on.
Great, thanks, Shannon. Yeah, so we did have a question from our chat. So how do we ask questions without coming across as accusatory or demeaning?
Yeah, that's a really common one, Allison. And so one of the things that I will often say is you have to ask yourself where you're coming from yourself. If you're truly caring and if you're truly, you know, in there for the best interest of that person, I believe that even in an introductory where you might fumble around with more of the closed-ended or the odd leading question, people will see through that. You want to basically be willing to step in. The other thing too is if you recognize that you're sort of at the front end of it, there's no reason why you can't tell people, hey, you know what, I'm working to get better at my inquiry skills. Beyond that, I'll say that if we truly use a behavioral approach, and if we are pointing out exactly what we see as opposed to putting blame on people by saying things like, hey, you're being unsafe, or you know what, you could get hurt here, people will see through that as well. So sticking with those good what and how questions, asking people's perspective is going to go a long ways in this situation. But they've got to be able to read that it's something that you mean and something that you care about.
Well, thanks for that, Shannon. Appreciate that. Wanted to thank again, Shannon, for your good presentation on changing culture through the use of questions. And we do have supervisor resources on our website. If anyone is interested in additional presentations, you have ideas for webinars in the future, by all means, give us a shout. We're here to support everyone.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone.